Joy and woe are woven fine, a clothing for the soul divine. Under every grief and pine runs a joy with silken twine. It is right it should be so. We were made for joy and woe. And when this we rightly know, through the world we safely go. So wrote the poet, William Blake. Joy and woe are woven fine, inseparable parts of life. Just so, death and life are woven fine. Stephen Jenkinson, a chaplain to the dying and their families, puts it this way: the last breath is there in the first. But most people in the predominant culture of this country do not rightly know that this is so. In a culture that denies death and tries to squeeze out maximal life at any cost, going through the world is thus harder than it needs to be. Children, I think, are less apt to avoid the subject of death. They have a natural curiosity about how the event of death and the condition of mortality fit into life. Likewise, children often experience life more directly than we grown-ups, who have internalized so many ideas and expectations from our culture. Children are closer to raw experience. In recent months, my 9-year-old child has on multiple occasions, usually while snuggling at bedtime, told me something like this: "Mommy, thank you for giving me life. I am glad to be here with people I love and who love me. I have a good life. Thank you and Daddy for having me. Thank you for giving me life." She told me it was okay to share this, by the way. And when I asked her later what brought this on, had there been some conversation in her religious education classroom or in a storybook in school about the blessing of life? No, there had not. It was simply a child's natural, unprompted upwelling of gratitude for being alive. Gratitude for life is how we are supposed to feel as adults, too, whether or not we actually do in day-to-day life. But the idea of being grateful for death, as our reading on the gifts of death invited us to do, that is a foreign concept, I think, to most of us in this culture. And that may be no coincidence. Fear of facing death, fear of feeling loss and feeling grief, that fear of opening up to difficult feelings cuts one off from the well of all feelings, including joy and gratitude. So the more one goes through life trying to deny death and avoid loss, the harder it may be to experience the joy that life offers. In a recent Yes magazine article, Sarah Chavez describes a new movement of women seeking to restore the idea of a good death, one that does not cut off the dying person or their loved ones from the process of dying. I'm familiar with the role of midwives and doulas at the other end of the life cycle, assisting mothers and their loved ones through pregnancy, childbirth, and the early days with a new infant. So it makes intuitive sense to me that a parallel trend is developing with the passage of death, complete with death doulas who support the dying and their families. Women are reclaiming roles in these sacred transitions that men displaced them from in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the male funeral industry and male obstetricians took over these special times of death and life and distanced families from them. The parallels in the passages of death and birth and our treatment of them as a society run deep. Now, one might expect to react very differently to birth and death, just viscerally. There's nothing like the touch of a warm baby with soft skin and supple, exploring limbs, Nothing like that new baby smell. Nothing like the little gurgling and cooing noises babies make, or the gentle rhythm of their breathing, or the instinctive way a baby will grip your finger and peer into your eyes as if you contain the universe. I am seized with the knowledge that a baby is a miracle. It might seem that someone who recently died could not appear any more different. The opposite of the baby in every way. From cold, pallid skin to utter stillness, silence, and the absence of spiritual spark or ability to connect with the onlooker. When a baby is placed in my arms, I feel more alive, more in touch with the flow of life. But curiously, I also feel this way when I encounter a dead creature. A while back, I came across a bird laying still on its side next to the trail. I stopped and stared at it in wonder for several minutes. I had the impulse to reach out in tenderness and caress its feathered body, although the germophobia I have absorbed kept that impulse in check. I felt a deep sorrow for the dead bird that I would not feel for the new baby at the other end of the life cycle. But the upwelling of tenderness and the experience of kinship with another life and a wonderment at my own being alive here, beholding this scene amidst the great throng of green and brown life and death in the forest, it was all very much like the awe and gratitude that accompanies contact with new life. Joy and woe, woven fine. Death and life woven fine, inseparable, one from the other. Death can throw life into relief, reminding you that you are part of this endless loop of death and birth, growth and decay. As Stephen Jenkinson observes, that realization can bring unbidden waves of gratitude and a sense of indebtedness that we somehow get to be here, get to hold the baby, hear the bird's song, see it flit through the trees, feel the breeze, slice the apple and taste its sweet tang and feel its crunch, mark the turning seasons, and mourn our dead, and someday be mourned. We get to be here. We get to have life. After I have been reminded of the impermanence of life, the change inherent in all things, I continue on down the trail, grateful for the unmoving bird, appreciating with heightened sensitivity all the details of the ever-changing scene of life and death in which I am immersed. I see the dead cells that make up the hard wood of the liveliest tree, with its youngest leaves at the tips of the branches furling out bright yellow-green. I witness the fallen leaves and other decayed matter that make up the soil that nourishes all the life around. I remember the atoms of stardust in my very body. I feel connected to ancestors I never knew, who knew the same joy and woe of life as a sentient mortal being. Great are the gifts of death. In his book, Facing Death, Averell Stedford tells the story of a woman who was diagnosed with a terminal illness. He writes, Mrs. N was a very particular housewife who felt she should clean her home every day. She did not entertain often, for it was such an effort. Everything had to be homemade and to a high standard. When she realized she might only have a few more months to live, she thought things out and altered her ways. On Sunday mornings, she would go out in the garden straight after breakfast, making the most of good weather while she could, however dusty her horse might be. Before, she had entertained her grandchildren once a week to a meticulously prepared spread. Now, Stedford observes, after the diagnosis, she wanted to see as much of her grandchildren as possible, and they came 3 times a week, ate store-bought cakes, and everyone enjoyed themselves immensely, for she had become more relaxed, more interested in them, and less in her own performance as a hostess and grandmother. Later, as her illness progressed and she could do less, she had fewer regrets and more good memories that she might have had to occupy her mind when she could no longer be active. The knowledge that she was dying gave Mrs. N a new freedom to be fully present in the moment and enjoy her life and her relationships. Okay, how perfect is it that there's a baby crying? I love it. You or I may not have many more years to go than Mrs. N did at that time, but our diagnosis is essentially the same. Life is a terminal condition. In contrast, in our culture, which seeks heroically to stave off death and grasp onto any sign of life, sometimes it is hard for people to face dying, even when it is right at hand. I have mentioned Chaplain Stephen Jenkinson several times. He has come to be known as the angel of death because of the presence he offers for this life passage. In a documentary about Jenkinson, a young couple he visits are shown struggling with their child's stark condition. Only a few years old, the little girl is being kept alive despite her grave illness by modern technology. The chaplain talks with the parents about their child's status. It's clear that they are not able to be present to the fact that their child is actually dying. They can't name this aloud or really take it in. Someone from outside the medical system, the angel of death, has to coax the recognition forward. The couple had felt that this knowledge was not okay to know, that their duty as parents was to fight for the implausible and hold out to the last. But through their conversation with Jenkinson, they come to feel that they have permission to accept that their child is dying, to let that knowledge in. The parents describe what a relief it is to give up on medical miracles and take their daughter home to die in peace. Her life will no longer be artificially and painfully prolonged. They can say their goodbyes. They can properly grieve. Later in the documentary, Jenkinson tells the filmmaker, another person he has helped to grapple with death, what he believes death to be. Death, he says, is personal knowledge. Death is necessity. Death is justice. Death is mercy. Death is a sign of compassion stitched into the universe itself. And this knowledge of death is important for everyone, not only persons in so tragic a circumstance as parents witnessing the dying of their child. Jenkinson asks the viewer, how will you carry what knowing that you will die does to you all the time? How will you carry what knowing that you will die does to you all the time? Here again, William Blake's poem. Joy and woe are woven fine, a clothing for the soul divine. Under every grief and pine runs a joy with silken twine. It is right it should be so. We were made for joy and woe. And when this we rightly know, through the world we safely go. Joy and woe, death and life are woven fine. This does not make grief easy. On the contrary, the deeper we love, the deeper grief will cut when we lose someone. How then do you offer comfort to someone who is grieving? Most importantly, I believe, by simply being with them. Listening, if they want to talk about their loved one and their feelings, or if you're actually with the dying person, listening to them talk about their own life and their memories and what it means. You can offer comfort to the grieving, perhaps especially by honoring the invisible connections that person had in life to their family and friends, connections that do not end with death. And by honoring the natural course of grief, however long it takes, all the ways it manifests, the different stages, the way life will never be the same again for the survivors. You can let the grieving person see that whatever they are feeling, whatever they have to say, whatever they want to do with their grief, you as a companion and a friend can abide with them through it. That's what grief needs. What grief does not need is a magic cure. Megan Devine writes, "Grief no more needs a solution than love needs a solution. We cannot triumph over death or loss or grief. They are immovable elements of being alive. If we continue to come at them as though they are problems to be solved, or get solace or comfort in our deepest pain." I believe the death phobia of our dominant culture hurts not only the ability of many people to face death before it happens and as it is happening, but hurts also our ability to contact grief and let it work through us. In most other times and cultures, people can be real about death and real about the deep grief that is inevitable if one loves life and lives deeply and loves deeply. If we are able to face death and fully experience grief, we may find that grief has gifts for us too. I went to the exhibit recently at the Kimball Museum about the later years of Claude Monet, the French Impressionist painter. This visual artist suffered cataracts and partial blindness later in his life. His painting skills were as masterful as ever. His changing perceptions translated to the canvas, with results no less beautiful and moving than his earlier works, though markedly more abstract. Surgery brought improvement to his eyesight. But the life change of his later years that could not be forestalled or recouped was the death of Monet's second wife and his son. The artist stopped painting for a significant time. I imagine he gave himself over fully to his grieving. He spent more time in his gardens, continuing to cultivate living things and taking solace in their beauty while he mourned those dearest to him. When he returned to the canvas at last, he broke forth into a new phase of creativity with new vision and verve. Monet's later works exhibited a novel perspective. On large-scale canvases and installations, new evocations of color and form, and a mesmerizing sense of movement, at once soothing and engulfing. Perhaps Monet's ability to follow the natural course of his grief released these new possibilities from the artist. The climate crisis and climate grief offer humankind a similar opportunity at the species level. If we can face the possibility of the death of our entire species, the possibility that humans may go extinct, as many other species now are, how much creative energy might it free up for a new vision to emerge of how we can live on this planet? The climate crisis offers the opportunity, if we choose to take it, to remember what a gift life is and to reassess how we will use this precious gift. Do we want to go on building empires and burning through the earth's finite resources, trashing our home and causing immense suffering? Or are we ready to move through this midlife crisis of our species and move into a stage of maturity, wisdom, and restraint, even self-sacrifice for the good of future generations? How can we return to the essential perception of a child who understands what a gift life is and that what really matters is our web of relationships? Joy and woe are woven fine. Death and life are woven fine. In the documentary about him, one thing that struck me about Stephen Jenkinson, the angel of death, is his close connection to nature. He observes that direct longing for connection to life opens up when you are in the places that you belong, the geographic places, the landscapes. Of Scotch-Irish heritage himself, Jenkin has close friends who are Indigenous and has learned from them something about living in close connection with the land where he now lives. You see him oaring through the water in a handmade canoe. The canoe becomes a metaphor for the passages of birth and death. The boat is skeletal, with a spine down the middle, a series of thick ribs that cross the spine and extend up the sides, and a skin of thin wood, all stitched together. A camera follows the canoe as it glides through the water, like an animal carrying the human spirits that are its passengers. When Jenkinson talks about his mother, he describes her as the canoe that brought him into the world. She has now died, setting off in her canoe, he says. She is now in the current, moving on without him. There's a peace in Jenkinson as he describes his mother. He misses her, but he understands his place in the land that he belongs to, his place in the lineage of his family, his place in this grand existence that we are all privileged to be a part of. The grief that's for real, Jenkinson explains, comes from recognition of how life is and must be, that it requires death, because death feeds everything that lives and includes not just you, but the people you love and what you don't want to end. Life and death, woven fine. The chaplain says, "I feel gratitude to the sun every morning for showing up again, and that I'm there to see it." As we face the reality of death, may each one of us know the gift of life for what it is and accept with gratitude the sun's return each morning. So may it be. Amen.